Jack had always dreamed of leaving his small hometown, with its quiet streets and mundane routine. The city represented freedom, excitement, and endless possibilities. After finally moving to the bustling metropolis, he felt the weight of isolation lift off his shoulders. The fast pace, the noise, the lights, it was all new and he loved every bit of it. His apartment was small but affordable, tucked away in a neighborhood that wasn't too far from downtown, yet quiet enough to allow him to think and breathe amidst the chaos. But Jack quickly realized something. The city wasn't all it seemed. The crowded streets and loud nights, though filled with promise, brought with them a sense of loneliness that he couldn't shake. It was hard to make real connections in a place where everyone seemed to be in a rush to get somewhere else. He spent his evenings in his apartment, mostly watching TV or reading. But every so often, the call to experience the nightlife tugged at him. One Friday, Jack decided he needed to step out, to lose himself in the city's pulse. He wanted to see if the excitement he'd heard about was real. So, he ventured into one of the popular clubs downtown, drawn by the thumping music that reverberated, even from the sidewalk outside. The air was crisp with the onset of winter and the streetlights flickered overhead. Jack wasn't much of a partygoer, but tonight he would be someone else. A stranger in the crowd, anonymous and free. The line outside was long, filled with young people eagerly chatting about their plans for the evening. Jack joined the line, feeling an unfamiliar sense of anticipation building inside him. He couldn't predict how the night would unfold, but he was ready for whatever came next. As the doors opened, the sound of music enveloped him, the bass vibrating through his body. The crowd was dense, the atmosphere electric, and Jack found himself caught up in the swirl of people moving to the beat. The flashing lights danced on the walls, casting surreal colors across the room. There was a kind of magic in the air, a promise of adventure, and Jack couldn't help but feel a bit giddy. The night felt like it was full of infinite possibilities, and Jack was ready to see what this city had to offer. As the night progressed, Jack found himself nursing a drink at the bar. The place was chaotic, with people shouting to be heard over the music and flashing lights adding to the surreal nature of the club. Jack, though surrounded by others, felt somewhat alone. It wasn't that he disliked the loud atmosphere. Rather, he felt out of place among the crowd. His eyes scanned the room, taking in the frenetic energy around him when he noticed her. She was standing by the bar, her back straight, her posture confident, yet she seemed somehow detached from the chaos that surrounded her. Natasha was striking, a woman whose beauty was understated yet undeniable. She had dark, almost black hair that cascaded down her back, and her skin had an ethereal, almost ghostly quality to it. But what drew Jack in most were her eyes, deep and dark, like two black pools that seemed to see right through him. She didn't smile as she caught his gaze, but there was an undeniable magnetism in the way she looked at him, something both inviting and unsettling at once. Before Jack knew it, they were talking. Natasha spoke with an ease that made Jack forget the noise around him. It was as if they were in their own world, separate from the chaos of the club. Her voice was calm and deliberate, each word seemingly chosen with precision. Jack was captivated. He couldn't put his finger on it, but something about her seemed almost familiar. They shared a few drinks, their conversation drifting from topic to topic. Natasha was well-spoken, charming, and intelligent, but there was something off about her, a kind of detachment, a sense of being somewhere else. She didn't seem to be in a hurry, and she didn't seem to care that the night was passing by. It was as if she was already somewhere beyond the present, as though she had seen everything there was to see. Jack felt drawn to her, almost as though she were a puzzle he wanted to solve, and so, after some time, he agreed to follow her when she suggested they leave and go somewhere quieter. Her offer to show him her apartment seemed harmless enough. After all, she was so intriguing. Perhaps she was someone who could help him escape the monotony of his life. Jack followed Natasha out of the club, the cool night air hitting him like a splash of cold water. The city felt different at night, quieter yet still pulsing with energy. As they walked down the sidewalk, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking in a dream. The sounds of the city seemed to fade, and for a moment it felt as though he were in a bubble, completely removed from reality. Natasha led him through side streets that Jack didn't recognize, a quiet part of the city he hadn't explored before. The buildings here were older, worn down by time. They passed by narrow alleys and darkened doorways, and Jack began to wonder if he had made the right decision. But Natasha seemed completely at ease, her pace never quickening, her stride confident as she walked ahead. He couldn't help but follow, captivated by her and intrigued by where she was taking him. They eventually arrived at an old, run-down building on the edge of the city. The entrance was a heavy wooden door, the kind you only saw in ancient structures, and it creaked open with an eerie groan as Natasha pushed it aside. The hallway was dimly lit, with flickering lights and a musty, stale smell hanging in the air. Jack hesitated for a moment, unsure of what exactly he was stepping into. The building seemed out of place, as though it belonged to another time, another world. It was quiet, too quiet, and the silence was deafening. But Natasha didn't seem concerned at all. She led him up a flight of stairs, her heels clicking softly on the worn steps. Jack could hear the faint echo of their footsteps, each one making the silence feel more oppressive. His curiosity began to shift into unease, but he pushed it aside, telling himself it was just the building's age making him feel this way. Natasha's calm demeanor reassured him, and he followed her up to the third floor, where she opened the door to her apartment. Inside, the space was surprisingly neat, though sparsely furnished. The room was dimly lit by a single lamp, casting strange shadows on the walls. The air felt cool, almost unnaturally so, and Jack felt a sudden chill run through him, though he couldn't say why. The apartment was small, with old hardwood floors that creaked beneath Jack's feet as he walked in. The furnishings were old, mismatched, and seemed as though they had been collected over a lifetime rather than carefully chosen. A faded rug covered the floor, and an antique couch sat near the far wall, its fabric worn with age. The windows were covered with thick, heavy curtains, blocking out most of the outside light, and the room felt strangely dim and cold despite the radiator in the corner. The atmosphere was oppressive, as if the air itself had thickened with time. Jack couldn't help but feel a strange sense of unease as he looked around the room. The walls were covered in dark wood paneling that made the space feel even smaller, as though the apartment itself were trying to close in on him. He couldn't shake the feeling that this place was not just old, it was ancient, almost as if it had been forgotten by time itself. Jack took a seat on the couch, trying to make himself comfortable, but the weight of the room seemed to press down on him. He looked over at Natasha, who was now standing in the doorway, watching him with an unreadable expression. There was something unsettling about her stillness, as though she were waiting for something. He tried to make small talk to ease the tension, but it was hard to ignore the oppressive atmosphere. The silence was suffocating, and the deeper into the apartment they went, the stranger things felt. Jack had never been in a place like this before. It was as though the building itself had a life of its own, a dark history that lingered in the very walls. The further he went into the apartment, the more it felt as if the building was watching him, as though it knew something he didn't. Jack walked deeper into the apartment, but the chill in the air intensified, wrapping around him like an invisible force. The room, though well kept, felt like it had been abandoned for years. It wasn't just the temperature. There was something unnerving about the way the shadows clung to the corners of the room. He glanced at the walls, which seemed to close in on him with every step, their dark wood paneling swallowing the light. A subtle buzzing sound hummed in the background, but Jack couldn't pinpoint where it came from. His breath became visible, the air growing colder with each passing second. He moved to pull off his jacket, but his hands were trembling. The overwhelming silence of the apartment was broken only by the creaking of the floor beneath his feet, and it made his heart beat faster. Natasha moved gracefully to the other side of the room, not seeming to notice the oppressive coldness. Her back turned as she fiddled with something on a shelf. Jack hesitated, feeling a rising unease, but he couldn't bring himself to leave just yet. Something about Natasha kept him rooted in place, even though every instinct screamed for him to run. As he stood there, he noticed something strange. The apartment seemed unnervingly still, as if frozen in time. There were no clocks, no pictures on the walls, and the only light came from a lone lamp that flickered intermittently. It didn't feel like a place someone lived. It felt like a place someone had left behind a long time ago, perhaps even forgotten. Suddenly, the buzzing sound grew louder, more intense. It came from all directions, making his head ache. And then, as if answering an unspoken question, Natasha turned and looked at him, her smile cold, almost empty. "Isn't it beautiful here?" she said softly, her voice strangely hollow. Jack wanted to reply, but his throat felt tight. The air felt thicker now, and the walls seemed to pulse with an invisible energy. There was something about this place that didn't belong in the world he knew, and in that moment, Jack wondered if he had made a terrible mistake. Jack's unease deepened as he stood in the eerie quiet of the apartment. The temperature plummeted further, and now the cold bit at his skin. He rubbed his arms to stave off the chill, but it didn't help. Nothing helped. His breath fogged in front of him. A low humming sound began vibrating the air around him. It was so faint at first that he thought he had imagined it. But then, the flickering light above him started, a slow, rhythmic blink casting strange, warped shadows across the room. The longer Jack stood there, the more unnerved he became. Natasha was now sitting on the couch, her back straight and unmoving, her gaze fixed on him like she was waiting for something. She didn't seem to notice the oddities around them. The flickering lights, the increasing cold, the humming sound that now seemed to reverberate through the walls. Jack stepped back toward the door, his instincts screaming for him to leave. But when he reached for the handle, it was stuck. It wouldn't open. He pulled harder, but the door remained firmly shut, as though some invisible force was holding it closed. Panic began to build in his chest. The hum grew louder, more oppressive, and the temperature dropped even further. A faint whisper seemed to come from the corners of the room, unintelligible voices that he could barely hear but which made his skin crawl. He spun around, half expecting someone else to be there, but it was just him and Natasha. Or at least, that's what he thought. As Jack struggled with the door, Natasha finally spoke, her voice calm, almost soothing in its monotony. "You can't leave, Jack," she said, her tone flat, but somehow laced with a dark promise. Jack turned to face her, his breath quick and shallow. "What do you mean? The door won't open?" His voice wavered with fear, but Natasha only smiled, slowly, like she knew something he didn't. "I told you before," Natasha said, almost as though recalling something she had already explained 100 times. "My family has always been with me. They never leave." Her eyes glinted in the dim light, but there was no warmth in them. It wasn't the kind of look one gives when speaking of family. It was the cold stare of someone who had seen too much. Jack felt the weight of her words sink in, his blood running cold. "Your family?" he echoed, unsure of what to say. The humming sound seemed to grow louder in the room, and the shadows shifted in strange patterns along the walls. Natasha's eyes flicked to the corners of the room, and Jack followed her gaze. There was something unsettling about the way she looked at the darkness, as if it were something alive. "My family has always been here," she said again, her voice growing darker, more intense. "And they want you to stay." Suddenly, a cold gust of wind whipped through the room, even though the windows were shut tight. The curtains fluttered violently, and the shadows on the walls seemed to stretch and reach out toward Jack. His heart raced. It wasn't just her cryptic words, it was the way she said them. The way the room seemed to close in on him like it was alive, watching him. The stillness in the apartment was broken by a loud bang, like a door slamming somewhere deeper within the apartment. Jack jumped, his heart thundering in his chest. He turned toward the source of the noise, but Natasha was already standing up, walking slowly toward the hallway as if she expected it. Another bang sounded from the same direction, followed by the faintest whisper, so faint that Jack could hardly hear it. The whispers seemed to come from all directions, a disjointed murmur, unintelligible and alien. Jack's skin prickled with a sharp, cold terror. He strained to hear, but the more he listened, the more the voices began to overlap. It sounded as though there were dozens of people speaking at once, but not in any language Jack recognized. He took a step back, toward the door, but when he reached for the handle again, it wouldn't budge. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, and the cold seemed to intensify, until it felt like he was trapped in a nightmare. His heartbeat pulsed in his ears, drowning out the sound of his breath, until all that remained was the hum, the voices, and the oppressive silence of the room. Jack turned to Natasha, his fear mounting. "What is that?" Natasha's eyes locked onto his with a knowing look, a smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "They've come for you," she said softly, as Jack's eyes darted nervously around the room, and that's when he saw it, something he could never have prepared himself for. The shadows on the walls weren't still anymore. They were moving. Slowly but unmistakably, the darkness seemed to stretch, twist, and slither like living creatures. The shapes in the corners of the room writhed in unnatural ways, contorting and bending as if they were being pulled by invisible strings. A wave of pure terror surged through Jack as he backed away, his body shaking with fear. The shadows didn't just move. They followed him. They shifted with his every step, crawling along the floor, creeping up the walls as if they were coming for him. Every part of his body screamed at him to run, but his legs felt frozen, as though the very floor beneath him had become sticky and impenetrable. The temperature in the room had become unbearable, but it wasn't just the cold. It was the presence of something watching him, waiting for him. Jack tried to call out, but his voice caught in his throat. His eyes locked on Natasha, who stood still, her gaze fixed on the twisting darkness, her smile never faltering. "The family," she whispered almost lovingly, "wants to play with you." The shadows intensified, filling the room, their dark tendrils crawling along the ceiling and walls, drawing closer and closer to Jack. It was then that Natasha moved. She wasn't walking. No, it was something far worse. She glided toward him, her movements unnaturally smooth, like a predator stalking its prey. Her eyes, once dark, now glowed with a bright, blood-red light. The intensity of her gaze sent a jolt of pure fear through Jack's chest. He backed away, his body trembling uncontrollably, but Natasha followed him, her eyes burning with an unsettling hunger. "You can't escape," she said, her voice now cold and distant, as though someone else was speaking through her. Jack's breath hitched in his throat, and his mind raced. He needed to leave. He needed to escape. But every exit, every possible way out, seemed to vanish before his eyes. The shadows now reached toward him, stretching their claws in his direction, and Natasha was almost upon him. With one last desperate cry, he lunged for the door, his fingers fumbling for the handle. But it remained locked, and no matter how hard he pulled, it wouldn't give. In that moment, Natasha's voice echoed in his head, and everything seemed to slow down. "You'll stay with us," she whispered, her voice almost hypnotic. He could see her face contorting in ways that were not human, distorted, twisted by something ancient and malevolent. His mind raced for a solution, for a way to break free of this nightmarish trap. He couldn't move. His body felt like lead, as if it had been frozen in place by some dark force. Just as Natasha's outstretched hand reached for him, her fingers cold and ghostly, Jack's entire body tensed. The shadows clawed at him, and the oppressive darkness pressed down on him like a heavy weight. With a scream that seemed to come from deep within him, Jack suddenly felt a violent pull, a force so strong it yanked him away from the door. It wasn't Natasha's grip. It wasn't anything he could see. It felt like being dragged by invisible hands, and before he could comprehend what was happening, he was flung backward into the farthest corner of the room. He slammed into the wall, his body battered and bruised. But he didn't have time to register the pain. The terror in his heart reached a fever pitch as he watched Natasha, now hovering in midair, her glowing red eyes fixed on him, begin to laugh, a low, guttural sound that sent chills through his very soul. The room seemed to twist around him, and for a fleeting moment Jack wondered if he was losing his grip on reality. But the force that had pulled him away was still there, an unseen presence that seemed to protect him, pulling him further from Natasha. Jack fought to stand. Natasha screamed, a sound that seemed to reverberate in every corner of the room, and the shadows recoiled. She wasn't the woman he had met at the club. No, this was something far older, something that had been lurking beneath the surface all along, waiting for its chance to take hold. Jack's instincts screamed at him to get out, to run, to flee, but the force of the apartment's grip on him was undeniable. With all the strength he had left, Jack managed to push against the force, using every ounce of his will to break free. His legs were unsteady, but he ran, pushing past the door that had once been locked, now swinging wide open as if inviting him out. He stumbled into the hallway, breathless, his heart pounding in his chest. As he ran down the stairs and into the cold night air, Jack could feel the temperature rising. He was free. But his relief was short-lived. The shadows still clung to him, swirling in his peripheral vision, as if chasing him down, hungry for him to return. Natasha's voice echoed, in his head, her cryptic words following him. "You'll never escape." He ran faster, his feet pounding the concrete, his mind focused solely on escape. He darted through empty streets, through alleyways, not looking back. But no matter how far he ran, no matter how fast, he could still feel the presence of the apartment, the shadows, and Natasha closing in ever closer. Jack's mind was in a blur. He had no idea where he was going, just away. His breath came in ragged gasps, his thoughts racing. Was it real? Had he imagined it all? Was Natasha still there, waiting for him to return? As he turned a corner, he stopped abruptly, his eyes widening. In the distance, he saw her. Natasha stood in the middle of the street, her glowing red eyes staring directly at him, her lips curling into a smile that sent a wave of nausea through him. She didn't move, but Jack knew she was waiting for him to come back to her. His legs shook beneath him, but he forced himself to turn around, running faster than ever before. He couldn't stop, not now. Not when he knew that if he ever looked back, the nightmare would start all over again. Jack ran and ran until his legs could carry him no more. He didn't stop, not for anything. And yet, somewhere deep inside, a terrifying thought lingered. Was he truly free? Or was Natasha and the darkness still following him, always, just behind, waiting for the moment when he'd be too tired to run anymore? The terror would never leave. Not truly. As Jack continued to run, his heart heavy with dread and his mind consumed by the horrors he had just escaped, one undeniable truth lingered in the back of his mind. Never trust a stranger. The events he had just lived through, every terror, every chilling moment, began with a single encounter in a club with someone he thought was harmless, someone who seemed kind and inviting. But behind that friendly smile lay something far darker, something insidious. Jack had been deceived by the facade, and it nearly cost him everything. This is a reminder for all of us. Trust your instincts, and be cautious with the people you meet. Not every smile is genuine, and not every friendly face is what it appears. The world can be a dangerous place, and while most strangers are harmless, some may harbor hidden motives. In Jack's case, his decision to follow a stranger led him into a nightmare from which he may never truly escape. Always stay aware. Always stay vigilant. And remember, if something feels wrong, it probably is. Trust those around you, but never lower your guard. In the end, safety lies not only in the people we choose to trust, but in the choices we make about who we allow into our lives.